Hi, Bob.
Hello, mate. How you going?
It's Michael Pearce from Adelaide. How you doing?
All right. Yeah, yourself?
Very well, very well. A pleasure to say hello again.
Yeah, it's been a while, hasn't it?
It has been a little while.
Yeah.
How's that book going?
Actually, good. Yeah, I've sort of not completed the first draft, but I've got a couple of other bits to do. But the meat and potatoes are done. I've got to do a prelude to the end and maybe add a couple of little anecdotes in it. But I've started the reading of it and doing corrections and changes and that. So I'd say hopefully within the next, say, I don't know, month to 6 weeks, the actual text part will be finished, and then I've got to sort out photographs and all that stuff. But getting towards the home stretch.
Magnificent. Looking forward to it. I'm sure it's going to be a great read.
Well, there's some funny bits and some. Well, there's tragedy. There's hilarious funny bits. There's inside stories and information. There's all sorts.
On the subject of tragedy, and the reason why we say hello is sadly the loss yesterday of one of, well, in my humble opinion, the greatest heavy rock singer ever, the one and only Ronnie James Dio.
Yeah, it was a very, very sad loss. He was not only a good musician and a good writer and performer and singer and all the rest. He was a nice bloke. So yeah, it is very sad. But I suppose looking at the donut instead of the hole, he had a very full life. We got a lot out of him while he was here, and at least he's in peace now, because towards the end apparently he was suffering, and that's not good. So when that starts to happen, I think wanting people to hang on is just for selfish reasons. So I'm just glad he's not suffering anymore.
No, so true indeed. And you would be, I think, the only Australian musician who's had the honour to play on stage and record with Ronnie.
Yeah, probably so. Yeah, I should imagine that I'm the only Australian musician to have done that with a lot of people.
That's so true.
Guitarists and singers and all sorts. Yeah. But yeah, it was an honour. I mean, at the time of me joining Rainbow, which was, I think it was August '77. I'd come out of Widowmaker. Now, Widowmaker was doing quite well, but getting into Rainbow at that time, they were big names. It was a big band, and it was, it was a big step for me to go into that. So, and I remember Ronnie being very, very nice, sort of, very hospitable and accommodating and just friendly. When I first joined the band, because even though I got on okay with Richie Blackmore, and I got on very well with Cozy as well, but Ronnie was. He always seemed to go out of his way to be nice to people,
Well, that certainly seems to be a common theme that the comments that everyone makes about Ronnie is that he was an exceptionally likeable person indeed.
Yeah.
So were you on tour with Rainbow when you the last tour with Widowmaker?
Yeah. Well, I'd finished an American tour with Widowmaker, and Widowmaker was, like I said, doing well, but I don't know. I just felt that I had to go further than that. And there was a friend of mine in Los Angeles called Dick Middleton, and I looked him up when I got to LA. He was living in LA with his family. He's an English guy, but I'd been in Mungo Jerry with him.
Yeah.
And he knew Richie very well. And when I saw Dick Middleton in Los Angeles, he said, Richie Blackmore's looking for a bass player for his band Rainbow. He said, I know that they've auditioned about 40 bass players and they haven't found anybody they like. Would you be interested, And I said, well, certainly I'd be interested at least. So I just wanted to find out more about it. And then I met up with Dick Middleton and Richie Blackmore. We all went out just for sort of a few beers and a laugh and really a social sort of. I think really with Richie it was a social audition, if you know what I mean, because I suppose if he'd met me and he thought, oh no, I couldn't have this twat in the band, I wouldn't have even got an audition, So I remember Dick Middleton telling me, he said, Richie likes to see people first to see if they even entertain the idea of an audition. So that night Richie and I were, we got on fine together. So he said, do you want to come down and have a play? So I went down to a studio where they were at, and I had a play. Richie put me through the paces, and we tried all different sorts of styles and, tempos and approaches. And at the end of it all, Ronnie and Richie and Cozy went off and had a little powwow and came back and they said, well, you've got the gig if you want it. And the funny thing is, I remember saying to them, well, I'll think about it. Because I didn't want to leap straight head first into it, because I was in a democratic situation with Widowmaker, and it was like partly my band, and with that I'd be sort of, I knew at the time that I would be a sideman with Richie, and he did have a reputation of, tuning people up and spitting them out, and I even, there were lots of people saying to me, you've got to do it, it's a great opportunity, but there are also others that were saying, be careful, you could be out on your ear in 3 months and not have any band or work or income, so I did have to think about it for a little while, but I remember having a long conversation with my wife in England, and she just said, look, you just have to do it because it's too good of an opportunity. So I, got stuck in and made that decision. Actually, the decision was made for me because the last gig we had to do with Widowmaker was in Los Angeles at the Whiskey, and that they had several serious squabbles on the road during the tour. And after that gig, we came off stage, went to the dressing room, and they started up again. I thought, oh, fuck this. And I went up to the Rainbow, because Richie Blackmore and I think Cozy came to the show that night at the Whiskey. And he said, I'll be up at Rainbow. Now, I think Richie he thought that I'd already made the decision to join, but I hadn't. But when all that shit started up again at the end of the Widowmaker gig, that made the decision for me. I thought, fuck this, I'm not having it. I said, I'm going up to the Rainbow, and it was sort of literally and metaphorically. So I went up there, and Richie was waiting for me. As I walked in, he stood up and clapped.
A sixth sense, indeed.
Yeah.
So, and I guess so from the songwriting point of view, Bob, because you're an exceptional songwriter, and I guess you were working with Widowmaker, but then to come into Rainbow, where Richie and Ronnie were the songwriters.
Well, I understood that. I was starting to get the ball rolling with song ideas and lyrical ideas, musical ideas, all sorts with Widowmaker, and that seemed to suit that situation. But going into Rainbow, I thought, I can't push my nose into something where it's not wanted or really not needed, So because it was they were very set in their ideas and ways of how they wanted Rainbow to sound and what the material was going to be and all that. So I just sort of, took a back seat for a while, and and it was a bit like, say, with Gary Moore as well. I didn't write much with Gary Moore because Gary was very self-sufficient. It's like he was good with lyrics, he was good with musical ideas, songs, and that's what the Rainbow situation was like. So, it's one of those things that, if you're not needed, you're not needed. I understood that. So, I wasn't put out by it. I thought, just take it for what it is and do the best you can under the circumstances, which I did. And I found it a very enjoyable situation. I learned a lot from it. I learned from Richie and Ronnie and Cozy and the whole situation, the way that, machine was run, well-oiled and reliable and professional.
Well, you certainly came into a time in Rainbow that the band was doing stadium work in the United States, so, it doesn't get bigger than that.
Well, that's right. That was my point before, and I said I went from Widowmaker to a band that was, doing arenas and headlining everywhere. Some of the shows we didn't headline if there were territories, like as an example, we were on the bill with Cheap Trick sometimes, and depending on what territory we were in, if it was our territory, we'd headline, and if it was a territory that they were stronger, then they'd headline. But, most of the time we headlined.
And you came into Rainbow, the recording of Long Live Rock and Roll had already begun, hadn't it?
It had. Richie had played bass on a few tracks already, and then they were in between bass players, and I came in. But fortunately, I got to play on, I thought, some of the best songs on the album. Gates of Babylon always thought it was a classic, and I'm glad I got to play on that one. And the other really strong one on the album was Kill the King, and I got to play on that as well. So, I would have liked to have played on the whole album. Well, actually, there was one track that didn't have bass on it anyway, the sort of acoustic-y one. But the other tracks that did have bass on it, would have been nice to, to play on them all. But Richie had done a few before I came in.
And Gates of Babylon was one of the tunes from that album that Ronnie continued to perform in Dio. And
did he do Gates of Babylon in Dio?
Yes, he did. As one of the few.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and Kill the King.
He toured with Ronnie in 1998 with his band Dio when he had Tracy G on guitar, and I got a call. I think I got hooked up with Wendy and their bass player. I don't know what was going on with him. He had to take care of something and couldn't do the tour, personal things or health issues or what. I can't remember what it was. But they asked me to do the tour, and I did. I flew up to LA and rehearsed with them for a couple of days, and then we went to London, and from London across to Scandinavia, and we were in Scandinavia for about 3 weeks, and that would have been October or November in 1998. We didn't do Gates of Babylon on that, but we did all the classic, Dio stuff.
Mm. Oh, and you mentioned Kill the King, and that was well rehearsed into the repertoire before you joined the band, but a great tune as well.
Well, that's it. Before I got to record the track, we were doing it live anyway. So, to record it, I was very well rehearsed because we used to play it every night anyway. But yeah, it was a good song.
And the other one I like from that album that you didn't play on, but I think one of the other tunes that you took on tour was LA Connection, only because it sort of, I think, gave an indication of the way the Rainbow sound would go from that point. Yeah,
that's, for me personally, even though I thought the whole album was a good album, LA Connection was a bit ploddy to me, and I thought they were trying to do a bit of a, I don't know. I know that the thing with Bad Company and the simplicity of the Bad Company stuff, which they really pulled off. I love Bad Company. I thought they were a brilliant band. But it was becoming a bit sort of in vogue as that sort of style, and I thought they were leaning towards that because of that trend, which I didn't really go along with. And I thought LA Connection came out a bit ploddy, but it was still okay. Not one of my favourites.
And you toured extensively on the strength of that LP. So, is there any memories you have of special memories you have of that tour?
It was very hectic, and we covered a lot of territory within about a year, I suppose. I'd been in the band about a month or 6 weeks when we did that show in Munich. And it was televised, and it's just come out on DVD in the last couple of years.
Yes, another one.
It's called Rainbow Munich '77 Live or something.
Yeah.
But that was a particularly good show, I thought, because we were under pressure because Richie had been in jail a couple of nights. And he ended up getting to the show really late. There's all sorts of stuff like that in my book about the details of what happened and how it happened and why and all that. So, all those stories are in detail in my book, and it's too complicated to tell now. But Richie had been in jail for a couple of nights, and it looked like our gig was going to be off. But he ended up arriving. We were supposed to be on stage at about 8 or 8:30 or something like that after the support act, the opening act. But we didn't go on until, it must have been 11. It could have even been midnight. I know it was a really late one. And the audience were really good. They stayed and waited and were patient. But after that, it was all Europe, all Scandinavia. And in the new year in '78, it was a long Japanese tour, which was like most people toured Japan for 10 days, 2 weeks maybe. I think ours was about 3.5 weeks. And we did everywhere. We did 3 nights at the Budokan sold out, which is the biggest stadium in Tokyo, and then all round America and Canada, and it went on and on and on. Some of the shows were brilliant, but like I said, some territories we weren't as strong, as maybe some of the others, which is that Richie the Rainbow was it was a nice draw and a nice sort of spectacle for the audience, and that was a computerized rainbow that changed colour and did all sorts of things above the stage, but
until it broke down.
Well, it wasn't so much break down. It used to interfere with the amps, and Richie would get this awful buzz, really loud buzz through his amp, and it used to really piss him off. because even though it was state of the art for those days, it was modern technology, computerized Rainbow. Now it'd be sort of old hat. It'd be way more perfected nowadays. But it was effective for the it was spectacular, but sound-wise it didn't always. Not Richie in the best of moods.
And after Rainbow, I believe that it was on the cards that that you and Ronnie would work together again, but Black Sabbath put a stop to all that.
Yeah, well, I remember during the American tour with Rainbow, one afternoon Ronnie saying to me, if this grinds to a halt or if the band breaks up, and I thought, uh-oh, does he know something I don't, Obviously he must have either got wind of it or had a feeling that something was going to happen, or... So he said to me, well, if I get a band together after this, would you be interested? And I said, yeah, certainly. And I said, well, if Rainbow happened, I said, because I like Ronnie and I like working with him. So we planned that, and then at the end of the American tour, that did happen. Cozy was the only one to stay, but he only stayed a little while, and he got replaced as well. So Richard wanted a new lineup and a new approach, which I thought he sold out a little bit. I always thought, the new version of Rainbow. I know you can't knock success because they had successful singles, that charted and did well, but for me it wasn't that sort of classic Rainbow sound anymore, or even the musical approach. So, I think to me it just seemed like a bit of a sellout, but so the plan for Ronnie and me to get a band together was put in motion, and Ronnie and I talked on the phone. I was in London and he was in America. It went on for a little while, him ringing me and saying, well, hang in there, I'm just talking to record companies and I'm looking around for guitarists and, it'll happen. And finally, I went up the road one day and I bought, New Musical Express or Melody Maker or one of the trade papers. And on the front cover it's got Ronnie James Dio joins Black Sabbath. And I thought, I would have preferred to have heard that from Ronnie himself, but I couldn't blame him for, taking a great opportunity, because it was a, wonderful opportunity for him, and it improved Black Sabbath no end, because Aussie had just been fired for being, drunk and non-productive. So to get, and who's and whose suggestion do you think that Ronnie joined Sabbath? Sharon Osbourne. She was Sharon Arden then.
Yeah.
But it was her that suggested Ronnie for Sabbath.
Okay. Sharon has been the bane of your life on many occasions, mate.
Oh, God. Well, not just me, many people.
Indeed. So back onto your autobiography, Bob. I dare say there's be some very interesting things about that part of your career in there.
Well, it's all interwoven, throughout, because I first met the Ardens and Jet Records, and that in 1975 when we got signed to Jet Records with Widowmaker. And then after that, I was in Rainbow, but then I came back to Jet Records when I hooked up with Aussie. And then when that folded, I went off and did the Uriah Heep thing, and then back to Aussie again, and then Gary Moore and the Sabbath album and all the other stuff. But in and out of the camp, so to speak. But it was so it's way too complicated to even begin to explain how I ended up in those situations, why I went back, and all the underhandedness and that to tell you now. Because there's pages and pages about it in my book, but it does all, explains it all, because I often get, questioned about that, and they say, well, why did you go back? And in the camp, out of the camp, in the camp, and it's well explained in my book, so people will understand what happened, how, and why.
I'm really looking forward to it, Bob. I'm sure it's going to be very well received.
I hope so. I've had a lot of good comments so far. People just writing into, MySpace and Facebook and the website and all that about, when they find out that I'm writing a book, and they're all very keen to read it. So that's great. I'm pleased about that. But it's not just that situation. There's lots of stuff in there. There's Gary Moore. There's the Sabbath stuff. There's tragedy and sadness, but there's some funny stories. It's well. I mean, sometimes when I'm writing, I'm just I relive it to write it, and I'm laughing out loud as I'm writing it. 'Cause there's some funny stuff in there.
Like I say, look forward. So, is there anything musically happening for you at the moment?
Well, for the last 15 months, I've really been concentrating on the book. That's been my main thing. But when the book's put to bed and it's out there in the public arena, and then I'll concentrate on doing something else musically, because I've been speaking to Joe Lynn Turner and Jeff Watson about doing another Mother's Army album. So,
magnificent.
yeah, that's a possibility. And when Steve Morse and Don Airey were here just a couple of weeks ago with Deep Purple, I met up with Steve and Don, and we're talking about the possibility of trying to get together at some stage to do some more Living Loud stuff.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful news indeed.
That's difficult, being that Jimmy Barnes and I are here in Sydney, and Steve Morse is in Florida, and Don Airey's in England, and Lee Kerslake's in England, and everybody does different things. And I know Purple work a lot, so it's just a matter of pinning everyone down at the same time in the same place. And to do that, sometimes it gets expensive, because you've got flights and hotels and accommodation and all this stuff, and unless you get a decent-sized record advance, which doesn't happen a lot in this day and age, it becomes difficult to do. But we'll manage it somehow. We'll work it out.
All right, Bob. As always, a great pleasure to say hello, and thank you so much for sharing some of your experience with Ronnie. It was great to go back and hear some of that, mate.
Yeah, it's a very sad day yesterday. In some ways I was surprised, because I was living in hope, I suppose, like a lot of people, that he would pull through and he would beat it and he would get over it and get back on his feet. But I suppose it wasn't to be, and I suppose we had him here for quite a while with a very full existence that he had while he was here, and like I said, I heard that he had been in pain towards the later stages of his illness, and so I'm just glad he's not in pain anymore and he's at peace. He'll be sadly missed in lots of ways, because, like I said, he's not only a great singer, he was a nice bloke.
Indeed, indeed. All right, mate, and you take care, and I will be very keen to talk to you again when the book hits the shelves. So.
Certainly, yeah, let's do it.
All right, mate. Thank you again for your time. As I said, it's always a great pleasure to say hello and talk to you soon.
Okay, mate, all the best.
Cheers, Bob. All the best. Bye-bye.
Bye.